Okay, let's talk about Noah's flood, washing away millions of years. The Grand Canyon is an amazing place. I've had the privilege of going there over 20 times, usually going down the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon with geologists helping lead the trip. But whenever you stand at the north of the south rim, if you're thinking at all, you have to ask the question, when and how was all this formed? How did those rock layers that are just as flat as a pancake, they extend for thousands of square miles, how'd they form? And when? And that hole in the ground, it's 4 to 18 miles wide, it's 280 miles long, it's a mile deep. Did the Colorado River cut the Grand Canyon? Or did the canyon form the river? And when did that happen? And when you get down and look at those layers, you sometimes see fossils in those layers, and there are more layers on top of those as you go north and east into Utah, Wyoming, Colorado. And the evolutionists picture the history of life with charts like this that represent 3.8 billion years. I have found, as I have spoken on this subject in 37 countries, that most Christians haven't even thought about Noah's flood. Most Christians who accept the millions of years, even theologians, haven't thought about Noah's flood. But the flood is critical to the question of the age of the earth. And so we need to really think carefully about the flood. In the history of the church, there have been 4 views of Noah's flood, and we looked at this in the last session. For 1,800 years, Christians believed that it was a historical, global catastrophe. It really happened when the water reached the highest level, the whole planet was covered with water. And it was a catastrophe of unimaginable destructive power. But in the early 19th century, some Christians began to say it was a historical local flood, it was a historical global peaceful flood, or it was a myth. And we don't have to refute a global peaceful flood because it's an oxymoron. But there's plenty of biblical, historical, and extra-biblical historical evidence that this event really happened. But I want to present some of the biblical and then the geological evidence that this was a global catastrophe. First, the purpose of the flood. In Genesis 6, God says that he sent the flood to destroy man and beasts and creeping things and the fowls of the air. And then verse 13, behold, I will destroy them with the earth. So contrary to what a lot of Christians think, the purpose of the flood was to not to simply destroy sinful man, but also all the land animals and birds and the surface of the earth. And only a global flood will accomplish that. Because if the local flood view is correct, then the flood was in the Middle East. And then animals and birds on the other continents could care less whether there's a flood in the Middle East. So only a global flood will accomplish the purpose. And then there's the purpose of the ark. God tells Noah to take 2 of every kind of unclean animals and 7 pairs of the clean animals. Why? To keep offspring alive on the face of all the earth. If the flood was local, then there's no need to put the animals in the ark because most of them are already outside the flood zone. And even if all the animals died in that flood zone, animals and birds outside would migrate back in and repopulate the area. And as for Noah, building the ark was a ridiculous building project if it was a local flood. He could have just told the family to go on a vacation to Europe. But the ark was absolutely essential. But as soon as we talk about the ark, people scoff. They say, well, there's no way you could fit all the animals in that ark. Well, you couldn't fit them in that ark. But it wasn't a little floating bathtub with giraffes sticking out the head out the chimney. So we got to get that idea out of our heads. But we also have to get it out of the heads of our children. And we have to stop buying all those books that have bathtub arks on them. Because in the English language, we've got dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of bathtub ark books teaching kids about the flood. And if that's the only picture they ever see, when they get old enough to think about it, they're going to say, well, there's no way you could fit the animals in that ark. So I guess the story of the flood is a myth. I haven't been wandering around in this church, but I'm pretty sure I won't find a picture of an ark like that. But I've been in many churches where I go into the preschool Sunday school classroom, and there's a big, beautiful picture of a bathtub ark. And they need to paint those pictures over, and they need to paint a realistic ark, like the Bible gives us the dimensions of. It was about equivalent to 1.5 football fields long, half a football field wide, and about 4 stories tall. It had about the same displacement as the Titanic, so it was a really big boat. In the history of the church, most of artwork has pictured it realistically as a barge. But research by scientists working with models have concluded it's really difficult to make square corners out of wood. And that particular design, experiments with models in the laboratory have indicated that design just naturally causes the boat to turn sideways in the waves. So it'd get hit broadside and it would just roll in the waves. So as a result of studying ancient ships, we designed the ark like this. The Bible doesn't give us a picture, so we don't know for sure. But a lot of ancient ships had a keel and then something like a wind catcher at the other end. And that just, in experiments, that just naturally causes the boat to stay perpendicular to the waves. It had 3 decks, and we can calculate the volume capacity. It was equivalent to about 450 18-wheeler trucks. And Noah was told to take 2 of every kind on the ark, not 2 of every species. And creation scientists who studied the question of what were the original created kinds, we think the kinds are at the level of family in the modern classification system. Species, genus, family. So Noah didn't have to take 2 poodles, 2 German shepherds, 2 wiener dogs, 2 wolves, 2 coyotes, 2 dingoes. He just took 2 dogs. And creationists and evolutionists are in agreement that probably the first dogs were something like a gray wolf. And in their genetic code was all the information to produce all the variety of wild and domestic dogs we have today. He just had to take 2 horses on the ark and in the genetic code of those, and God brought the animals to the ark. They would eventually produce all the variety of horses we have. And so creation scientists have studied the creation literature. They published scientific literature about breeding animals in the wild, animals in captivity, and we think there were only about 1,400 kinds and about 7,000 animals, average size about the size of a sheep. Most birds are way smaller than that. And God brought the animals to the ark. He wouldn't bring the biggest animals of each kind. He wouldn't bring the big Apatosaurus, the big T-Rex, the big elephant, because those are old. They won't have any reproductive potential after the flood. So he's going to bring junior elephant, junior T-Rex, and they will require less food, less maintenance, less space, and they will have plenty of years after the flood to repopulate the earth. And then there's the character of the flood. Now, if it was designed to destroy all the land animals, birds, and people on the earth, and the surface of the earth, it would have to be violent. But there are a couple verses that bring this out. One, we only have time to discuss one. In Genesis 7:11, God says, in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were open. 2 sources for the water. The next verse says it rained 40 days and 40 nights. Now this was not a gentle rain to water the garden. This was a rain that was an expression of the wrath of God against a sinful world. This was monsoon rain, Hurricane Katrina rain. 24 hours a day, day after day, week after week, for at least 40 days, but then the Bible indicates that it continued to rain. Maybe not nonstop everywhere, but it continued to rain because God didn't close the windows of heaven until the 150th day in Genesis 8, verse 2. But this alone would be catastrophic, because if there was any slope to the land, the soil would quickly become supersaturated with water, and you would have mudslides like the mudslides in Southern California look like a Sunday school picnic on a sunny day. But that probably wasn't the primary source of water, because it's not mentioned first here in Genesis 7:11, and it's not mentioned first in chapter 8, verse 2, when God closed the fountains of the great deep and closed the windows of heaven. Now, in the Bible, the great deep usually refers to the ocean. So fountains of the great deep is subterranean water coming into the oceans. And the word fountain implies that it's under pressure. And since it's coming deep within the earth, it's very logical to think that it was also under high temperature. And then in English, we have broken up. That's a translation of one Hebrew word. And it's used several other places in the Old Testament. It's used in the book of Numbers when Korah rebels against the leadership of Moses. And God says, I want the children of Israel to move away from Korah and his family and his livestock and his tents. And the Bible says the ground opened, same Hebrew word, and their tents and their livestock and their families went into the earth. It was a small earthquake. The same word is used in Zechariah 14, verse 4, a prophecy about the second coming of the Messiah, Jesus. And it says that his feet will touch the Mount of Olives east of Jerusalem, and the mountain will split in two, and a huge valley will form. So this one word is loaded with geological significance, because it's telling us that at the beginning of the flood, and for the next 150 days, the crust of the earth was breaking apart in many places. Now, if you have an earthquake, you often have volcanoes. And there are a lot of volcanic mountains on the ocean floor. And if you have a volcano or an earthquake on the ocean floor, what are you going to produce? Well, you're going to produce a tsunami. And we know what tsunamis produce. That Japanese tsunami a few years ago, tsunamis send off a wave screaming across the ocean floor. A ship can be on the surface and not know that there's anything going on. But when that wave reaches a continental mass, it raises the whole ocean. It doesn't just make a big wave. And you can go on YouTube and watch a video from a helicopter as that water in that tsunami is rolling across the coast of Japan. And in some places it went inland, I think 6 kilometers. And it destroyed everything in its path. So just imagine, you have tsunamis, earthquakes, volcanoes, and torrential rains. You have a catastrophe of unimaginable destructive power. And anything not in the ark is going to perish. Sometime between the 40th and the 150th day, the waters covered the whole earth. And creatures which could run to higher ground would, but eventually there wouldn't be any higher ground, and they would be swept away by those floodwaters. Then there's the height of the flood. In Genesis 7, it says, all the high hills that were under the whole heaven were covered. 15 cubits upward, and the mountains were covered. So water always seeks a level plain. To have a local flood in the Middle East that covers just some mountains in the Middle East, you'd have to have a flood like that. But you've never seen a flood like that, because to have a flood like that, God would have to, so to speak, put his hands around the Middle East and block every single mountain pass. But there's nothing in the biblical text that says he's trying to contain the waters of the flood. So that idea is unbiblical and illogical. The last biblical evidence that I have time to mention is the rainbow promise. God said in Genesis 9, never again will I flood the earth, and the rainbow is the sign of that promise. And who did he make the promise to? Well, he made it to Noah and all of his descendants, to the animals and all of their offspring, and he made the promise to the earth itself. And he made the promise 3 times in the space of about 10 verses, just so we make sure we get it. If the flood was local, God lied. because there have been many local floods that have killed some animals, some birds, some people, and destroyed some of the earth. Only a global flood fits the rainbow promise. Now, what would we expect to find from this global, year-long catastrophic flood? Well, we would expect to find, after everything settled down, after the waters went into the post-flood oceans and into subterranean cavities, and after everything dried out, if we could drill down into those sediments, we'd expect to find billions of dead things buried in rock layers that were once soft sediments of sand, silt, clay, mud. We'd expect to find evidence that those layers were deposited by water and not in a desert. And we'd expect to find the evidence all over the earth. And that's exactly what we find. Billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. We find marine fossils on the tops of our highest mountains. The Himalayas, the Alps, the Andes, the Rockies. How did they get there? Well, they weren't washed up there. Those mountain ranges are all made of sedimentary rocks that used to be horizontal. They were buckled, they were bent, they were forced up during the latter stage of the flood. But that fossil record is a record of death and pain and killing and disease and extinction. And the evolutionists for the last 200 years have said that's the evidence of millions of years of history. But really, most of it is the sobering testimony of Noah's flood. So let's look at the geological evidence, and I'll remind you again that in the 1840s we had those three competing views of Earth history, but the first and the second view passed off the scene. The uniformitarian view became the ruling view in geology. And something very unexpected happened in the 1970s. Some evolutionary geologists began to reject that uniformitarian thinking and go back to the ideas of the early 19th century catastrophists. Now, they didn't believe in the flood. They didn't believe that the earth was just thousands of years old. They didn't believe the Bible. They believed in millions of years, but they said slow, gradual processes doesn't explain everything we see. And one of the leading neo-catastrophists was Derek Ager. He was a British scientist in Wales. He was professor and head of the geology department at Swansea University in Wales. He wrote 4 books on geology, 200 technical papers on geology. He visited over 50 countries of the world studying geological formations. He was the head, the president of the British Geologists Association at one time. The last book he wrote was published just after he died. And in the preface, in bold font, he wrote a sentence warning people like me from using anything in his books to support our view. But he's dead now, so I do it all the time. Because what he had to say is true and very revealing. He's writing in another one of his books called The Nature of the Stratigraphic Record. So he's talking about the strata of the earth, those sedimentary layers. And he's got a chapter on the history of geology. And he's writing to his fellow evolutionists, and he says this: "My excuse for this lengthy and amateur digression into history is that I have been trying to show how I think geology got into the hands of the theoreticians." In his mind, those were the uniformitarians of the early 19th century, who were conditioned by the social and political history of their day more than by observations in the field. In other words, we have allowed ourselves to be brainwashed into avoiding any interpretation of the past that involves extreme and what might be termed catastrophic processes. What's he talking about? Well, he's saying to his fellow evolutionists, look, when we went to high school, we took our first geology class, and our teachers taught us slow, gradual processes will explain everything you see. We went off to the university. We majored in geology. We got our PhDs in geology, and our professors taught us slow, gradual processes of erosion and sedimentation will explain everything you see. We were brainwashed, and he was brainwashed. But then he went out, after he finished his studies, and he went out and started looking at rock layers in 50 countries, and the more he looked at rocks, the more he saw evidence of catastrophe. Well, I want to illustrate what he says here with a pop quiz. It's an exam. It's a one-question exam. It's multiple choice. Here's the question. Here you have two curved yellow lines. And the question is, what's missing? What was that picture originally? Was it A? Was it B? Was it C? Or was it D? I'll give you a chance to think about that. How many of you think it was A? B? C? D? How many of you are afraid to answer the question? Bunch of cowards. Well, we'll grade the exam right now, and the correct answer is nothing's missing. It was drawn that way. Well, why did you think something was missing? Well, because I asked you what's missing, and you thought, well, he wouldn't ask what's missing if something's not missing, so I've got to figure out what's missing and put it into the picture. I controlled the way some of you thought about those two curved yellow lines just by putting a question into your head. Dr. Ager said we were brainwashed. We couldn't see evidence of catastrophe. In his last book, he gave a lot of examples of geological formations that had traditionally been interpreted as forming over millions of years, and he said they were formed in hours, days, weeks. One of the examples in his book was the Sutton Stone. It's a conglomerate. It's, as you can see, it's a rock layer that's made of different size pebbles and small boulders. And as you can see, they're rounded. They don't have any sharp edges or corners. That's because this material was ripped up from somewhere else, transported in water, and in the process, it all got jumbled together, and all those sharp edges and corners got rounded off, and then it got cemented together in a new location. He said this has usually been interpreted as the basal conglomerate of a diachronous transgressive sea. It has been suggested with very little fossil evidence that this conglomerate spans 3 to 5 ammonite zones, those are shell creatures in the ocean, and therefore up to 5 million years in time. He said, the story is that the ocean came up on the land, deposited some of that material, and then left. And then a little later it came up on the land, deposited more of that material, and then left. Over 5 million years. Well, he studied it, and he said, I think it was deposited in a matter of hours or minutes. Wow, that's a big difference in interpretation. 5 million years versus hours or minutes. What changed? Well, the rocks didn't change. His interpretation changed because he had become open to catastrophe as an explanation for what he was looking at. So as I said, everybody has the same rocks and fossils, but if you start with anti-biblical assumptions, you're going to come up with the idea of an old earth and no global flood. But if you start with biblical assumptions and you look at the same rocks, you see all kinds of evidence for a young earth and global flood. So it's those biblical glasses that are the key. Well, let's answer the question, how long does it take to make fossils? And the first thing you need to know is that when they dig up a fossil, it doesn't have a label on it saying how old it is. And they don't use radiometric dating to date the fossils. They don't even use radiometric dating to date the layers that the fossils are in. We'll talk about the dating methods in a little bit. But they usually use those dating methods to date volcanic rocks, lavas, ash beds. But here's an interesting statement by two evolutionists in a book on dinosaurs. Fossilization is a process that can take anything from a few hours to millions of years. Now stop and think about that sentence. How do they know it takes millions of years for a fossil to form? Has there ever been a geologist who's watched a bone turn into stone over millions of years? No. Well, could you get a whole group of geologists to overlap their scientific careers so they could say, well, collectively we saw this? No. Geology's only been a science for about 200 years. So how do they know it takes millions of years for fossils to form? Well, the answer is very easy. They don't. It's an assumption. How do they know it happens in a few hours? Oh, now we're talking about observational science. The amount of time that it takes for a bone to become completely permineralized is highly variable. If the groundwater is heavily laden with minerals in solution, the process can happen rapidly. Modern bones that fall into mineral springs can become permineralized within a matter of weeks. Not months, not years, not centuries, not millennia, and certainly not millions of years. What do you have to have for this to happen? Well, they tell us. Groundwater, heavily laden with minerals in solution. Can you think of any event in the Bible where you might have a lot of groundwater, heavily laden with minerals in solution? Yeah, Noah's flood, the fountains of the great deep. We have fountains on the ocean floor today that are hot, briny vents. They're filled with minerals. And as those tsunamis crash onto the land, they're going to pulverize rock. We're going to have a lot of minerals in solution. And Noah's flood didn't happen a few weeks ago. It happened about 4,500 years ago. The fossils themselves speak of rapid burial and fossilization. If you hit a deer along the road, and if the highway department doesn't come to pick it up, it won't become a fossil. Because we got lots of turkey vultures in this country. They'll come and enjoy steak dinners, and when they're done, the maggots will come. And the rain and the ice and the snow and the sun, that'll take care of it. If the highway department doesn't pick it up, nature will. But the fossils speak of rapid burial and fossilization. Here's an ichthyosaur caught in the act of giving birth, or a fish that didn't get to finish lunch. 2 turtles caught in the act of mating. A school of fish that either were buried alive or buried very quickly after they died. Some trilobites stopped in their tracks. A wasp wonderfully preserved. In Brazil, even the blood cells in the wasp are preserved. Charles Darwin said no organism wholly soft can be preserved in the fossil record. But he was wrong about lots of things. I have proof he was wrong about this. Here's a fossilized worm found in China. No hard parts. They have found on more than one continent fossilized jellyfish. And my favorite, fossilized coprolite, which is fossilized animal manure. Do we have any farmers in the audience? Could a cow lay a pie in the field and it stays in pristine condition for hundreds of years? No, it's going to become fertilizer. They've found dinosaur bones that are not completely fossilized. And they've even found blood cells and blood vessels. But these bones are supposedly 65 million years or older. But blood cells break down very rapidly. This is powerful evidence that these creatures didn't die millions of years ago. Now think about this. If the creatures were buried and fossilized rapidly, and that is what the fossil evidence indicates, it takes very unusual conditions to fossilize something slowly. So if they got buried and fossilized rapidly, then the sediment layers that contain the fossils must have been rapidly deposited and hardened into stone soon after deposition. You can't have the rock layers stay soft and wet for thousands or millions of years, but the fossils harden up because there will be oxygen in the water and microbes in those sediments. They'll eat all the evidence. So the fossils tell us that the rock layers formed rapidly. Well, how long does it take to erode rocks? Well, there's a beautiful area in eastern Washington called the Scablands, 15,000 square miles of rolling hills and valleys, cut into solid basalt. It's a massive lava deposit. And for years, the geological community and the tourist agencies said this area was carved slowly over millions of years. But today, there are even evolutionists who would say that most of this was carved by floodwaters in 1 to 2 days in solid rock. And the story of the change in the interpretation of the Scablands is very interesting. It's told by the late Stephen Jay Gould, the great Harvard paleontologist. And the area we're talking about is in eastern Washington, western eastern Washington state. And there was a geologist out there in the 1920s by the name of J. Harlan Bretz. He was an evolutionist. He believed in millions of years. But as he walked through this area, he became convinced that it was eroded catastrophically. He didn't know where the water came from. He speculated it came from the north. He published his first article in 1923 in a technical journal. It was immediately attacked. He was called names. They said his proposal was an outrageous hypothesis. But he was a rather thick-skinned guy, and he continued to do research. But a few years later, there was another geologist working in Montana, and he said, I think I found the water for that flood. The water's not there right now, but there's evidence of a lake that used to be in western Montana, and it's called Lake Missoula. And this other geologist said, at the end of the last ice age, the last of many ice ages, according to the evolutionists, the only ice age, creationists argue, at the end of that period, there was a dam, an ice dam at the end of this lake that was blocking a narrow valley. And as that ice retreated, that dam gave way, and that whole lake drained through what is now the Scablands, with water moving at an estimated speed of 60 to 100 miles an hour, carrying boulders the size of automobiles or small houses, and just scouring the landscape. Well, it was a few more years before the geological community finally agreed with Bretz, and they gave him, just before he died, the highest geological award that the Geological Society gives. But Dr. Gould tells the story this way. The establishment, as represented by the United States Geological Society, closed ranks in opposition to Bretz. Instead of testing Brett's flood on its own merits, they rejected it on general principles. What were the general principles? Uniformitarianism. Brett, you can't be right because everything must be explained by slow, gradual processes. Brett stood against a firm, highly restrictive dogma that had never made sense. The emperor had been naked for a century. Charles Lyell, the godfather of geological gradualism, had pulled a fast one in establishing the doctrine of imperceptible change. Dogma, doctrine. I thought that was in religion. No, it's in science too. It's usually not called dogma or doctrine. It's called a paradigm or a model. And it takes a very brave scientist to go against the majority view, because there's tremendous pressure in the scientific community for groupthink, to think what everybody else thinks. So we need to put on biblical glasses. And so let's do that a little bit more. And this is a video from our Creation Museum, which features our geologist, Dr. Andrew Snelling.
Rock layers are visible in mountains, plateaus, and canyons all over the world. Where did these rock layers come from? Present processes aren't the answer. Today, sand and mud are usually deposited in thin layers along the outer edge of continents. And the formation of fossils today is rare. But somehow in the past, thick layers of sand and mud were spread across entire continents and filled with well-preserved fossils. Noah's flood suggests a way to explain these puzzling features. Flooding the continents, for example, could carry sea creatures many hundreds of feet above present sea level. Andrew Snelling is a PhD geologist from Australia who has spent over 30 years studying rocks, working in the field and in the lab.
We find marine creatures buried at the top of the Grand Canyon, which is over a mile above sea level.
A global flood could carry sand and mud enormous distances.
Some of the sand grains that are in the Navajo sandstone had to have come from the Appalachians. But what river or what process today is carrying material from the Appalachians to the southwest?
A global flood could quickly lay down thick layers of mud and sand, burying even giant animals and tall trees.
We've got coal beds with trees sitting on them, and these trees, tree stumps, go through many strata, which means that before they could rot, you had to have lots of sand and mud coming in quickly. Several places in the Grand Canyon, 4,000 feet of different types of sand and mud and lime have been bent, and they've been bent while they're still soft. Both the bottom layer and the top layer are all bent the same way, which means that the whole sequence of 4,000 feet of sand and mud and lime had to have been laid down very quickly by the waters and then bent very soon afterwards.
A global flood could form thick layers across entire continents.
In the Grand Canyon area, we've got limestone bed, the red wall limestone. The same limestone can be found over here in the eastern United States.
A global flood could cut deeply and widely.
We've got this huge flat surface at the rim of the Grand Canyon, which goes for thousands of square miles, where waters on a great scale over a vast area just swept over it and swept everything clean.
None of these processes, deep, wide erosion, or thick, rapid layering, or continent-wide distribution, or lifting of marine organisms above sea level, or sand carried across continents, occur in the present. Radically different processes are required, such as occurred during Noah's flood.
Well, what about carbon dating and the other radioisotope dating methods? Well, the first thing you need to know is that radioactive decay was only discovered in the late 1890s. And then it took time to develop the method for using this decay to be a dating method. And so it wasn't until the 1910s that they figured that out. But geologists were already committed to millions of years, almost 100 years earlier. In fact, by the time they found out about radioactive decay, the consensus view was about 300 million years for the age of the Earth. So radiometric dating had nothing to do with convincing people of millions of years. But carbon-14 is never used by evolutionists to date rocks because carbon-14 decays very rapidly. The maximum you could date anything with carbon-14 is 80 to 100,000 years. So they would never date any rocks that have carbon in them because they think they're millions of years old. They'd say that's a waste of money and research time. But creationists don't believe those rocks are millions of years old. So they've used carbon-14 to date rocks. And one kind of rock they dated was diamonds. Now diamonds are pure carbon. And so they got samples of diamonds from, I think from Africa. And these diamonds were in a rock layer that was a different kind of rock, and so they used potassium argon to date that rock that the diamonds were in, and they got a date of 1 to 2 billion years, which isn't very accurate, obviously. But when they dated the diamonds that were inside the rock, the age of all of those diamonds was about 55,000 years. But that's using evolutionary assumptions. Creation scientists are trying to do some research on calibrating carbon-14 dating. We know that's not the right date, and we believe that Noah's flood had a huge impact on radiocarbon and its ratio to non-radioactive carbon, carbon-12, and so that would reduce these carbon dates much less. If you want to read more about that, you can just search on our website for carbon dating, and there's some articles for teenagers and lay people. But creationists have also dated dinosaur bones that are not fully fossilized, and they've found measurable amounts of carbon-14 in those bones that the evolutionists have said are millions of years old. So they don't use carbon-14, the evolutionists don't. So they use the other methods, uranium changing into lead, potassium into argon, rubidium into strontium, and these things decay very, very slowly, and that's where they get the millions of years. But there's good reasons to reject those dates. This is a famous mountain in New Zealand. It erupted 5 times between 1949 and 1975. Dr. Snelling, who was in the video, he's from Australia, he went over to New Zealand in the summer when the snow was melted, and the geologists have identified which lava flows went with which eruption. So he took samples of each of those lava flows. He prepared them just the way his professors taught him at the university. He sent them off to a radiometric dating lab. He did not tell them where he got the rocks. He wanted a blind analysis. He just said, they're recent. Well, they did. They used the potassium argon method, which at the time was considered the most reliable. And the results came back. These rocks are 270,000 to 3.5 million years old. But we know when those rocks were formed. They were all less than 50 years old, because the dating methods are supposed to tell us when the lava came out of the ground and hardened into solid rock. So the dating methods were wrong by just a little bit. When Dr. Snelling wrote up his research in a technical journal about this, he documented over 20 examples of rocks of known age where humans saw the lava come out of the ground, and the dating methods don't work. They give dates of hundreds of thousands or millions of years for rocks that are only decades or centuries old. But the evolutionists want to take these methods and apply them to rocks of unknown age, where no humans saw the lava come out of the ground. And they want us to assume that the methods work. But if the rocks don't work on the rocks we do know the age of, we shouldn't trust them on the rocks we don't know the age of. So what's going on here? Well, it's more assumptions, as this little video will explain.
Nearly every textbook and science magazine teaches that the Earth is billions of years old, and the primary dating method used for determining this is what is called radioisotope dating, or radiometric dating. Now, this is a reliable method for measuring absolute ages of rocks and the age of the Earth, right? First off, many scientists now regard the age of the Earth to be between 4.55 and 4.6 billion years old. Okay, so if this method is reliable and accurate, why the 50 million year discrepancy? That seems like a lot. But let's get into some details here and see what's going on. Keep in mind that there's all kinds of scientific jargon on this topic, and so we'll just present a very straightforward, simplified version of the process. Radiometric dating is the process of estimating the ages of rocks based on the decay of radioactive elements in them. Basically, there are certain kinds of atoms in nature that are unstable and spontaneously decay into other kinds of atoms. For instance, uranium will radioactively decay through a series of steps until it becomes the stable element called lead. The original element is called the parent element, and the end result is called the daughter element. Radioisotope dating is commonly used to date igneous rocks, rocks which formed when hot molten material cooled and solidified. The dating clock started when the rock cooled. During the molten state, it is assumed that the intense heat forced any gaseous daughter elements to escape. It is assumed that once the rock cooled, no more atoms escaped, and any daughter element now found in the rock is a result of radioactive decay since that rock formed. The decay rate is measured in terms of half-life. That is the length of time it takes half of the remaining atoms of a radioactive parent element to decay. Now, of course, that can be measured in a laboratory, and it is assumed that since we know the decay rate, we can calculate backwards and come up with the age of the rock. But is that all there is to it? Here's where it gets tricky. It's true we can measure a decay rate using observational science, but there's another kind of science that is required to accurately calculate dates for rocks, and that is what we call historical science. Historical science deals with the things in the past, and therefore it cannot be repeated and tested. Dating methods require both types of science, because in order to get accurate rock dates, one would have to accurately know both the decay rate and the initial conditions of the rock sample, right? Since radioisotope dating uses both types of science, we can't directly measure the ages of rocks. There are assumptions involved. For instance, how do we know what the initial conditions were in the rock sample? How do we know the amounts of parent or daughter elements now in that sample haven't been altered by other processes in the past? How does someone know the decay rate has remained constant since the rock formed? The answer is they don't. Let's simplify here and talk about a typical hourglass. Let's say you walk into a room and you see an hourglass with sand at the top and sand at the bottom, and some sand sprinkling from the top chamber to the bottom. Well, observational science would allow us to see and measure the sand, and then calculate how long the hourglass has been running, right? We could make our sand measurements and then calculate when the hourglass was turned over, right? Well, those calculations could be wrong, because we may have failed to consider some major assumptions, like, was there any sand at the bottom when the hourglass was turned over? Has any sand been added or taken out of the hourglass? Has the sand always been falling at a constant rate? Since we did not observe the initial conditions when the hourglass started, and we haven't been watching the sand all the time since then, we must make assumptions. All three of those assumptions can affect our time calculations. Now, of course, there's more to understanding all of this, but enough said.
So 3 assumptions in the dating method. What were the original ratios of the radioactive and non-radioactive isotope in the lava when it came out of the volcano and hardened into rock? Has the rate of decay of the parent to the daughter always been constant? The decay rates have only been measured for about 120 years since they discovered radioactivity. But the half-life of uranium is 4.5 billion years. So they've extrapolated from 120 years and assumed it's always been that rate back 4.5 billion years. But that's a huge extrapolation from 120 years to 4.5 billion. And then you have to be certain that your rock sample has been a closed system since it formed, that none of the parent or daughter isotope has moved in or out of the rock through leaching. Well, the scientists don't know that because they didn't see that rock all the time period since it formed. So there's no scientific method that can prove the age of a rock layer or the earth or the universe. Why? Because every scientific method must, 1, observe a present process of change, radioactive decay, the amount of sediments that are getting into the ocean from erosion, the amount of helium that is escaping into the atmosphere from radioactive decay. Those are all processes of change. So you've got to first observe that process of change, and then you have to make some unprovable assumptions about the starting condition of the process, which was in the unobservable, unrepeatable past, and you have to make an assumption that the presently observed rate of change has always been the rate of change in the unobservable, unrepeatable past. But scientists can never prove those assumptions. And those assumptions that they use are naturalistic, uniformitarian assumptions. So the only way we can know the age of the earth or the universe is if a completely trustworthy eyewitness of the origin and history of the creation told us. And he's told us in the Bible. His name is Jesus Christ. So if you go to the Grand Canyon and you talk to the park rangers, they'll talk about millions of years. But it's not really evidence of millions of years. That's some of the sobering testimony to Noah's flood. Now, just to be clear on this, those rock layers with all those fossils in them either formed before Adam or they formed after Adam. If they formed before Adam, the only reason you would believe that is because you're believing what the scientific majority says about millions of years. There's nothing in the Bible that would lead you to think that under the grass in the Garden of Eden were thousands of feet of sedimentary rocks containing billions of dead things. And if we take that view, then we're going to have to conclude that God could see what Adam couldn't see. He could see that under the grass were thousands of feet of sedimentary rocks containing billions of dead things, and he called all of that very good. But what kind of a God calls all of that very good? Well, if it didn't form before Adam, then it had to form after Adam. And if it had formed after Adam, the most logical cause of most of that rock record is Noah's flood. So if we believe in the millions of years, as most Christians do today, then we will have to ignore or reject Noah's flood. And that's what they do. But if we believe what God's word says, then this is a major reason to reject the millions of years. Because the rock layers and the fossils cannot be the result of millions of years and Noah's flood. It's one or the other. So This evolutionary chart, most of that is flood deposits. Some of the layers down at the bottom that don't have any fossils in them are just microscopic bacteria. Creation scientists think those are pre-flood, formed maybe on day 3 or in the period between day 3 and Noah's flood. And then some of the layers up at the top that are not geographically very extensive, creation scientists think those are post-flood deposits. So there really is no evidence for millions of years. Noah's flood washes it all away. Well, if the evidence is so strong, why don't people believe it? Well, I think there's 2 reasons. One is in Romans chapter 1. Because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. The Bible says that sin darkens the mind. It can cause people to think really strange things. Well, that's one reason why people don't see the evidence, because the flood speaks of a holy God. But a second reason is, in the words of Derek Yeager, we've allowed ourselves to be brainwashed. And it's not just geologists who are brainwashed, it's also lay people and students. But it's not just brainwashing. There's also censorship of the creationist views. Have you noticed what happens when a public school system or a state passes a law or a policy that students can be allowed to hear creationist arguments in the classroom? Have you noticed what always happens? The evolutionists call the American Civil Liberties Union to sue the school district or the state. But think about this. If evolution in millions of years is really proven scientific fact, why do they need to protect it with lawsuits? Really, they should, if it's really true, they should invite creationists into the public schools to present their views, because their students are all well trained by them, and their students will see right through the creationists. They'll see it's pseudoscience. So they should really welcome the creationists, but they don't. They have to censor it, and they censor it at the universities. That alone tells you that the whole thing is a myth. The millions of years cannot stand in the free marketplace of ideas. They have to exclude any challenge to that thinking. Well, in the Grand Canyon, here's some more evidence of the censorship. And you saw in the video this picture, although this is a better picture of the picture. This is one of the several places in the Grand Canyon where the rocks are bent. In this case, a 90-degree bend. And you can see a person down at the bottom to show you how big that bend is. Here's another example, Monument Fold. You can see that. I've seen that many times as you float down the Colorado River. That rock makes a bend. Here's another example. And the top layer is the Temple Butte limestone. It's said to be 385 million years old. The bottom layer is the Muov limestone. It's said to be 505 million years old. And Dr. Andrew Snelling, who was in the video, is standing there at the edge, and these layers are bent the same way. And the evolutionists say that there's 120 million years of missing time and material. But there's no evidence of any erosion between those layers. In fact, the whole pile of layers in the Grand Canyon on the northeast end are bent the same way. It's like a stack of pancakes that slipped off the edge of the plate, and they're all bent the same way. And yet the evolutionists say that pile of layers represents 270 million years, and the earthquake that moved them was about 70 million years ago. So they got 200 million years to harden. Another one of the layers is the Bright Angel shale. Now, shale is very brittle. We use shale to make roofing material. And look at how it bends. Well, Dr. Snelling, in 2013, wrote to the national park. He made a scientific research proposal to the national park. He wanted to take samples of these folds in the Grand Canyon. Now, he had already in previous years gotten 2 research permits to do research on other questions in the Grand Canyon, but he wanted to look at these folds because he believed that these folds, to the naked eye, they don't show any change in the rock as you go through the bend. And he said, that looks like those rocks were wet and soft when the earth moved. Well, the evolutionists would say, well, to the naked eye, it looks like the rock hasn't changed. But if you look at it at the microscopic level, it will show evidence of change. Well, Dr. Snelling wanted to take samples. And so he submitted his paper for 40 fist-sized samples of rock. You can't take any rock out of the Grand Canyon without a permit. It's against the law because it's a national park. Well, he waited, and he got a response back. They said, no, there's some mistakes in your proposal, and we want GPS coordinates of every place where you want to take your samples. He's never been asked for that before. He said, all right, fair enough. I can see I made a couple mistakes. So he fixed it, resubmitted the proposal, and he waited. And he waited. And he didn't get a response. Finally, he asked the Alliance for Defending Freedom, a Christian legal organization, to do a FOIA request, Freedom of Information request. We want to see all emails, phone calls, text messages about this proposal because we didn't say it, but we suspected there was viewpoint discrimination going on. And so they got that stuff because it's a federal park. The government has to give that information. And it was clear viewpoint discrimination. The evolutionary geologists who were reviewing his proposal didn't want him as a creationist to get the permit to collect the rocks. But now think about this. If the millions of years is really true, why wouldn't the evolutionists say, oh, give the guy the permit. He can collect his samples. He's a pseudoscientist. Whatever he writes, he can write in his creation journals. Nobody's going to believe it. Just give him a permit. They wouldn't let him have the permit. Well, once we found out about the discrimination, the Alliance Defending Freedom sued the national park and the Department of the Interior of the United States government to get the permit. And within a few weeks, he got the permit because the lawyers for the Park Service said, you can't win this. This is unconstitutional. And so he got the permit in May of 2017. In June, he got the green light to go into the Grand Canyon. He collected his samples. He came back. And then he has a friend up in Canada who has a special company. He can make very thin sections of rock that are so thin you can put them on a microscope slide, and then you can look at the crystals under the microscope. And so he looked at hundreds and hundreds of slides of the stuff that he collected. And he took samples for each of these folds. He took samples starting about 1 kilometer downstream and 1 kilometer upstream from the fold. And then he took a lot of samples through the fold because he wanted to see, does the rock change when it goes through the fold? And he found very strong evidence that these rocks don't change. These rocks were soft and wet. And he's published, I think, 6 highly technical articles in our Answers Research Journal about this. This is one of them. And I think the first one was 90 pages long with a 50-page appendix. So this is, I can read the title of the article and then the rest is way over my head. So there's brainwashing, there's censorship, there's efforts to block creationists from getting research, doing research. Our theologians are also brainwashed. Gleason Archer taught Old Testament at the seminary that I attended, although he was retired when I got there. In his very helpful book on the Old Testament, he said, From a superficial reading of Genesis 1, the impression would seem to be that the entire creative process took place in 6 24-hour days. He didn't believe that. He died believing in the day-age view. If this was the true intent of the Hebrew author, a questionable deduction, as will be presently shown, well, he went on the next couple pages to give biblical arguments for taking the days as long ages. I've read those. They're not persuasive at all, but I don't think those are the real reasons that he believed this. It's right here in the rest of the sentence. This seems to run counter to modern scientific research, which indicates that the planet Earth was created several billion years ago. Notice his choice of words. Scientific research. No, it wasn't the research. It was the anti-biblical, uniformitarian, naturalistic assumptions that were used to interpret some of the observations from the research. So again, the issue is not science. The issue is what glasses are we wearing. And the massive problem in the church is a problem of authority. And most of the church has bowed the knee to the scientific majority rather than bowing the knee to God, who's given us his inerrant word. And a lot of Christians are listening and believing Bible scholars who don't know what they're talking about, who have believed the scientific majority. Well, Jesus believed in the flood. He believed in the ark. He believed that Noah built the ark. And he said that judgment is a warning of the judgment to come. And just as there is only one ark and only one door to escape the flood, so Jesus is the door. He's the only way to escape the judgment that is coming. And so the flood is really, really important. It's really important in light of the coming work of Christ in redeeming this world from the curse and putting an end to all the wickedness and violence and disease and destruction. And it's really important for defending the truth and authority of the Bible. So that's Noah's flood. And I hope that encourages you to trust God's word and to continue learning and to help other Christians understand that the scientific evidence increasingly confirms the truth of God's word. God bless you for coming. Have a great evening.